Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, James. I stand up here on behalf of myself and Brooke O'Hara, who is my co-organizer on this 8-day pilot program called Performance Intensive, of which this lecture is a part. So on my and Brooke's behalf, we want to thank James, Natalie, Derek, Linda, and the whole ICA team for making this possible for us to be here. They all worked really fast and really generously to co-host this event with us. And I also do want to send a particular deep thanks to Karen Olivier. It's the installation space is a super fragile, precarious space, and it's an honor to be allowed into it, to occupy it temporarily. I'm going to just tell you just a little bit about the performance intensive, of which Tavia's talk will be in conversation, and then do a short intro before inviting Tavia Nyong'o up. The performance intensive is an 8-day performance laboratory, which is happening in Philadelphia from January 5th through the 12th of this year. During this intensive, 18 artists and makers working with performance in the context of visual art, sound, dance, and theater assemble for a kind of generative conversation that happens through both talking but also embodied activities, workshops, individual, collective praxis, exploration, trying things out. And one of the things that was important to us as a component of this was to convene also in and through public events. So there have been 4 public events that are part of this series, conceived of as part of this series, by leading artists and scholars working in the medium of performance. After tonight's lecture, there is one event left, and that is a performance by Dynasty Handbag, which will be co-presented by the Bearded Ladies Get Pegged Cabaret, and John Jarbo in collaboration with Fringe Arts. So that's at La Peg at Fringe Arts tomorrow at 10:30 p.m. So for any bordering on the night owls, please come out and see Dynasty Handbag. It's going to be a really great performance, and we're really, really fortunate and pleased to have her here in Philly to show her work. I want to acknowledge, just before I move on to the intro for Tavia Nyong'o, that our intensive and therefore this lecture is supported by the Sachs Program for Arts Innovation, the Center for Experimental Ethnography, the Weitzman School, the Department of Fine Arts, the Wolf Humanities Center, and our 4 public event partners, the Philadelphia Contemporary, the ICA, Fringe Arts, Icebox, Project Space. So, because we just got out of a workshop with Jibs Cameron, I feel I can, before I begin this intro, acknowledge its potential failure. This might be one of these things. I started to think as I began in this place that maybe it's one of those things that you get all the time and you're really tired of it, like that you have 30 intros that begin this way. So if that's the case, I pre-apologize. In the center of the screen of Tavia Nyong'o's website is a beautiful line drawing of a face, his face, a small portion of his right shoulder, and then this lower end of his hand and into the small part of his arm as it extends back up to rest on his head, maybe in what I would describe as a soft fist. Tavia seems poised in thought, in the middle of a question, or in some state of political readiness, or social openness, or ecstatic anticipation. Underneath the drawing is his name, Tavia Nyong'o, and underneath his name, in a smaller font, in all lowercase letters, are 3 short appellations, 3 short titles: writer, teacher, earthling. Whatever that thing is in web design parlance, it's also tagged so that it appears again when I click on the window drop-down to retrieve his site after I've gone somewhere else. Tavia Nyong'o, writer, teacher, earthling. It is such a fitting set of descriptions for this brilliant thinker whose prolific practice has probed so many of the conditions of collective inhabitation on Earth, and whose generous sharing of his work expands across many continents and gathers on a multiplicity of platforms. Equally fitting is that Nyong'o's work has so foundationally expanded our understandings of the time and space and communions that constitute earthly occupation, earthly activities. Nyong'o's work examines the relationships between the living, the dead, and the fictive, between people who are missing and those who carry them backwards and forwards. Nyong'o has written on brown punk, queer assemblages, disco and its discontents, on the juicy, delicious, and wild. His work unpacks and extends, considers askew the work of philosophers, theorists, artists, dancers, politicians, artworks, objects, cultural workers, and people, sounds, movements, records, ephemera that were never meant to appear, and whose labor must continually and repeatedly transgress the conditions that would erase them. Tavia Nyong'o's work has been foundational to the development of critical questions about and around performance, and it's a deep honor to have him here in the context of the performance intensive, because I really think of him as one of the earlier sort of shapers, someone who really shaped the set of questions, fields, possibilities, openings that circulate in this moment now. His work cuts across disciplinary boundaries to ask questions between and across performance, blackness, and queerness, and to excavate radical understandings of Black time, temporality, and embodiments. Tavia Nyong'o is a professor of performance studies at Yale University, performance and theater studies, I guess, is that the proper term? Where he teaches in American studies, African American studies, women's gender and sexuality studies, and theater studies, in all of those programs. His books include The Amalgamation, Waltz, Race, Performance, and the Ruses of Memory, 2009, which won the Errol Hill Award for Best Book in African American Theater and Performance Studies, and his 2018 book, Afro-Fabulations, The Queer Drama of Black Life. He is working on two current research projects, a study of Samuel Delaney and the emergence of queer of color speculation, and a set of essays considering cultural appropriation through the lens of queer East African aesthetic production. He is a longstanding member of the Social Text Editorial Collective and co-edits the Sexual Cultures book series with Anne Pellegrini and Joshua Chambers Letson. It's my and Brooke's deep, deep honor and pleasure to welcome Tavia Nyong'o.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for that very generous and kind introduction, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. I also want to thank the ICA and Karen again for letting us squat in her installation. Before I jump into this, and I'm also I want to thank the members of the Performance Intensive. I just think that I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we can have here today. You're in the middle of your week together, and I'm so grateful to be a part of that. If I seem a little more spacey than usual, it's because I just got off a plane from Nairobi and it's 3 a.m. there. So at some point I'm just going to draw an entire blank, and you'll know that's the reason why. But nonetheless, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else than here right now. Am I speaking too close to this? Okay, all right. So this is a piece that I wrote for this occasion, bringing together some threads of my work. Some of what you'll hear, if you know my work, it's going to be somewhat familiar, but I've also tried to, all the artists that I'm thinking about in this piece are people I'm writing about for the first time. So it's a combination of ideas that I've been percolating for a while, years, in some cases decades, but then also trying to be in dialogue with a new generation of artists. The field of performance studies is often understood by those outside it in particular as intentionally focused on the live arts. The conventions and demands of the academic division of labor reinforce this understanding, with departments of theater, dance, and the performing arts organized adjacent and apart from the departments of film, television, and new media. This institutional and organizational logic is underscored to a certain extent by one of the signal debates in the field over the last 30 years, the debate over liveness. Liveness, or the quality of being live as opposed to written, recorded, or otherwise mediated, has come to be one of the key terms in the performance studies lexicon. To the extent that performance studies is the site where this debate over liveness happens, the association, or even the equivalence between performance studies and the study of the live is underscored. That this state of affairs should be so is, of course, somewhat ironic, given that the terms of the liveness debate are constituted not around the assumption of liveness as a given object of study, but, on the contrary, by its problematization. Whether we consider the position of Peggy Phelan, for whom performance lives only in the now, or whether we take up the stance of Philip Auslander, for whom the category of the live only emerges as a reverse formation after the historical emergence of technologies of mediation. In neither case can liveness be considered as anything like a given. The critical adoption of an abstract concept such as liveness should itself signify the intention to avoid commonplace assumptions about what is live and what is not. When José Muñoz contributed to this debate by speaking of the burden of liveness for minoritized subjects, he helped endow this critical abstraction with a political edge. As I will be emphasizing throughout this talk, Muñoz illuminated the ways in which liveness could serve as both a space of possibility and peril for Black, brown, queer, and trans subjects. Taking just these three signal thinkers from the field as our initial coordinates, we may be able to formulate a tentative hypothesis, and that is that performance studies is not, as is commonly supposed, the site where the live gets privileged. Rather, performance studies is the site where the live-mediated distinction gets problematized and deconstructed. But why is liveness a problem? Shouldn't the presence or absence of embodied performers be one of the most obvious characteristics one could make about a work of art? The answer to this question is, somewhat surprisingly, no. There is little about live presence that is obvious, beginning with the language we use to account for it, a language that appears clear but turns out to be clouded with ambiguity. Consider the much-lauded ephemerality of performance, its coming into existence in and through its disappearance. The term ephemera, as critics from Muñoz to Rebecca Schneider have noted, can as easily refer to the manner in which performance remains as it does to the manner in which it disappears. Live performances always leave ephemeral traces, these critics emphasize, and performance studies needs methods and models for valuing and interpreting those traces. And to further the point, consider the use the term ephemera acquires in archival practice. In archives, ephemera refers to collected materials that evade ordinary classification. Ephemera, we can say, are matters that are in but not of the archive, just like performance itself. Much as liveness appears to be a simple matter but proves complex, the ephemeral appears to be a straightforward category but turns out to be highly paradoxical. The complexity of liveness is nowhere better illustrated than in the modes of Black performance that form my own primary field of study. from the vantage point of any minoritarian subject, a binary opposition between live and mediated performance is problematic because of the burden of liveness, and, I might add, increasingly because of the burden of mediation as well. Blackness, we can say, presents a challenge to binary oppositions, so-called black-white oppositions, insofar as blackness is frequently the site of opacity, of fugitivity, and of what Fred Moten calls the blur. Blackness, I've argued elsewhere, can be approached in both binary and non-binary terms, as a dialectical opposite of whiteness on the one hand, or on the other, as a contrary that refuses to affirm anything other than its own capacity to differentiate from non-blackness. It is this non-binary blackness, I warrant, that tends to present the most creative and interesting refusals of anti-blackness, particularly when we approach the burden of liveness. Seen from this perspective, Black performance studies presents an opportunity to deconstruct the associations between Black life and liveness, presence and positivity, and to introduce novel possibilities regarding the uses of technology, mediation, and the ephemeral. For an example of such a creative refusal, we might consider Keith Obadike's now somewhat legendary work of art from 2001, Blackness for Sale. For the work, the artist used the internet auction site eBay to attempt to auction off his blackness, explicitly noting in the product details that while this blackness may be used for creating Black art, and this blackness may be used for dating a Black person without fear of public scrutiny, among other various benefits, the seller does not recommend that this blackness be used while demanding fairness. Bidding reached $152.50 before eBay took the sale offline for violating its terms of service. But Obadike's point had been made, principally that the separability of blackness from Black people only appears to be a function of technology. It is instead a deeply ideological function embedded in the deep history of modern anti-Blackness. That is to say, while this artwork may seem initially to be a savage satire of eBay, internet commerce, and of the traffic in mediated blackness more generally, all of which it certainly was, I would argue that Blackness for Sale also served to highlight the burden of liveness. It did so through the implication that the imaginary transaction would endow the purchaser with the forms of aliveness and vitality that racism ascribes to Black people, while also, albeit less noticeably, raising the question of who Obadike would remain once his blackness had been sold. While positing Obadike's blackness as an heirloom possession he might rid himself of while making a few bucks in the process, what Blackness for Sale staged was precisely the inversion of how racial capitalism monetizes blackness through the dispossession of Black people. It is also worth noting how Blackness for Sale disembodied its author in a particular way. Noticeably absent, for instance, were any gendered framings around the blackness beyond the putative masculinity of its seller. This is not, I would suggest, because the auction block renders gender immaterial. To the contrary, it points to the limits of the concept of the body itself, with its assumptions of integrity, wholeness, and personality, and instead indexes the history of the captive flesh. And here I'm thinking and reflecting on the work, of course, of Hortense Spillers and all of those who have commented and been influenced by her, including Alex Weheliye, Christina Sharp, and the list could go on. Blackness for Sale has remained a germinal work of art insofar as it presaged subsequent post-millennial Black art, research, and activism that has remained focused on the manner in which technological advance both masks and intensifies forms of historical oppression. What this work highlights for me is the degree to which performance studies must remain conscious of how the body itself is not just mediated, but it remains itself a form of media. Obadike's work appeared at the start of the new millennium, just after the 1990s, a decade in which debates over liveness and mediation in art and technology took on a particularly hopeful set of coordinates and concerns. Where do we stand over 2 decades later in a world in which technological mediation has only intensified, but one in which much of the optimism of the 1990s has vanished? And what has been the fate of the burden of liveness in the new millennium, given the enduring centrality of minoritarian aesthetics to the field of performance studies? Addressing these questions take up much of my talk today, which builds upon 2 recently completed projects: my book, Afrofabulations, The Queer Drama of Black Life, and a special issue of the journal TDR, co-edited with Joseph Roach and Eliza Morrison on the topic of algorithms and performance. These 2 projects have, among other objectives, allowed me to pose a question: what is this life in the liveness debates? How does the question of technology and digital simulations of life and liveliness in particular continue to reshape this debate? And last but not least, for a scholar of Black studies, what role does race continue to play, not only in the burden of liveness, but in the very questions of social life and social death? And picking up, since Sharon was so kind enough as to point out that on my website I do identify as an earthling, I think we might think of these questions of social life and social death as questions of earthliness, of beings of the earth, that subtend our cultural conversation around automation, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. Centering Blackness as media allows performance and performativity to emerge as robust critical terms that can encompass a range of artistic practices, not only across the live-mediated continuum, but also in terms of degree of capture within contemporary societies of control. As John Mackenzie has noted, the double valence of the term performance, as on the one hand, open-ended aesthetic experimentation, and on the other, as rigorous completion of a task through to its end, hardly helps us sort through the consequences of these matters, particularly when one turns to the world of mathematics and the computational. The second valence of the term performance comes to subsume and dwarf the first. And this is a piece that may be worth talking about further in the, if we have a dialogue afterwards, but it's quite important to me that we think of these 2 definitions, these contradictory definitions of performance, particularly when it comes to Black performance, because of the centrality of histories of coercion in the Black experience, right? It's not just about experimentation and openness, but it's also about this sort of command performance. As my co-editors and I wrote in our introduction to our special issue of TDR, and I'll quote from that introduction, "Algorithmic selection as world-shaping performance, bringing to completion, fulfilling expectations, embodying results, is heralded as utopic and denounced as dystopic by turns. Encomiums come from artists whose horizons expand exponentially, working in new digital media. Critiques come from those who stand most likely to suffer from the fact that the new socially predicated engines operate at a quantum jump beyond the universe of disinterested numbers. Whether driven by social responsibility or unaccountable malignity, they do exactly as they are told, but faster and faster. With advances in machine learning, they are doing more and more on their own," unquote. In putting together the essays for the issue, my co-editors and I had occasion to linger over this oscillation between utopian and dystopian performatives. Speaking at least for myself, one tentative generalization that emerged from this survey was that interactivity per se, as enabled increasingly by computerized algorithms, has often been held up as a good over and against the passivity attributed to traditional mass media forms. While this assumption is highly debatable, and while I will have occasion to debate it, it leads to my second working hypothesis for this talk. And that is the observation that while performance studies, as the study of liveness, has tended to oppose or contrast itself with the old recorded media, performance studies as the study of audiences and interactivity has tended to embrace the potentials of technology. And this equation between interaction and technology might itself be ripe for rethinking, precisely when it gets towards the end, thinking about other ways in which we might actually interact with materials, technology, expanded senses of what a media in fact is. And this is actually where the arts come quite centrally to bear on this question. So this embrace, the embrace between technology and performance, however tentative, is both necessary and dangerous, as I and my co-editors found. While there is not so much point in taking an entirely aloof stance to the worlds quickly being wrought by artificial intelligence and machine learning, there is as much to lose by a position of resigned acceptance to the top-down changes being imposed by those with the most power to disseminate their vision of technological futurity upon the rest of us. In positing Black performance studies as a site of potential challenge to such resigned acceptance of societies of control, I draw upon the work of a number of scholars doing pioneering work at this intersection of fields, including Ruha Benjamin, Shaka McLaughlin, Simone Brown, Catherine McKittrick, Kara Keeling, and Denise Fahira de Silva. I also look to the work of artists like Mendy and Keith Obadike, Stephanie Dinkins, Martine Sims, Keon Williams, and Tiona McLaughlin to reconsider how Black artists, many of them feminist, trans, and queer, are reworking liveness and mediation in the contemporary moment. The leaps I'm making between artistic and technological media are deliberately speculative, even as the cross-pollination of ideas from performance studies, media studies, and beyond that I attempt may sometimes prove tentative. I'm driven towards this eclecticism by a strong sense that we need better tools to grapple with the dilemmas of art making and art theorizing in our present. If the algorithm increasingly represents the dominant cultural formation of our time, a contentious claim I know, it is nevertheless key that responses to that fact do not simply mirror its form and function. Throughout this discussion, as an aside, I have found that an inexact or anexact definition of the algorithmic is more useful than a precise one. This is both because such an anexact or vague sense of the algorithm is better attuned to the affective dimensions of the human-tech interface, but also because it opens up a pre-digital history of the algorithm that might otherwise be lost if we remain solely within the province of the technological. So here, I want to evoke Catherine McKittrick's timely reminder of all the ways that Black modernity has been bound up in mathematics, as far back as the grotesque calculation of weights and measures of living flesh through which the Atlantic slave trade was conducted. We might also attend to Denise de Silva's experimental notations of the modern subject as a kind of algorithmic equation that produces the Black female as a quote-unquote nothing from which anything becomes possible. Or to M. Norbesi Phillips' poetic rendition of the Zong massacre in which, in which captive Africans were thrown overboard a slave vessel in order to claim insurance payments. While it stretches the contemporary sense of the algorithmic to encompass all these historical examples within it, I would argue that we can best grapple with our contemporary moment only if we allow these racial genealogies of the algorithm to remain front and center. If the algorithmic represents, on the one hand, the ambiguous displacement of live enactments, while on the other, offering up the promise of a plenitude of novel, as yet undreamt of live interactions, then the two working hypotheses I have begun with bear clear implications for the futurity of what I have already called, via Muñoz, the burden of liveness. Muñoz's resistance to the common sense equation between liveness and performance, which he at one point terms an obstructive fetish for the field, had everything to do with the violent histories of the colonial modern, which tend to place people of color on display and outside history, laboring to display our eccentric particularities for a crypto-universalist white audience. It is this legacy, I warrant, that informs a more recent comment by Fred Moten. If the performances I have most usually invoked are not live, Moten notes in his recent work, Stolen Life, this has been a function of my preference for how Blackness, it's actually a blank slide right now, so I wonder if that's, Okay. The blackness of blackness here, right? So let me try this again. If the performances I have most usually invoked are not live, Moten notes, this has been a function of my preference for how blackness displaces the particular and sclerotic notion of presence that liveness is supposed to instantiate. Blackness displaces this idea of presence. Both Moten and Muñoz thus push performance studies to grapple with concepts of black and minoritarian performance that do not fetishize liveness or presence. What happens to such a push when it comes to race and the technological is my concern here. Can mediation restore that which liveness steals, or more likely, do both liveness and mediation remain problems, albeit problems of a different sort in our present moment? Okay, it's not as good an image as I would have liked. Okay. A recent work that draws attention to the burden of liveness in our contemporary media landscape is E.J. Hill's 2018 endurance piece, Excellentia Militia Victoria, in which the artist stood immobile on a sports podium in the vault gallery of LA's Hammer Museum for all 72, sorry, for all, let me get some water here. Did the screen become a lot more blurry just now? It was sharper before, right? Well, I guess it's the same. Okay, I apologize for that. I wish it were easier to see that. But that's what description is for, okay? So the artist stood immobile on a sports podium in the vault gallery of LA's Hammer Museum for all 78 days of its Made in LA biennial. And seen around the gallery are photos by another photographer taken of Hill doing laps around each of the institutions of education, starting with his elementary school and culminating in this sort of lap around, or victory lap, if you will, around UCLA, where he did his MFA. So in counterpoint to the accelerated circulation of art on Instagram and other algorithmically curated flows of images, Hill's work brought the viewer into a dyadic encounter with a black body in almost superheroic arrest. When you walk into the gallery, the sort of first thing most people see, well, you're kind of structurally positioned to see, is making a direct eye contact gaze with Hill on the podium. On the one hand, sports remains one of the most highly mediated and spectacularized modes of performance of the black body. In allegorizing his participation in Made in LA and in art more broadly to a sports competition, Hill both exceeds to the punitive demands for presence and subverts them. He exceeds insofar as he places his body literally on display during museum hours, but he subverts through that self-same context of the museum gallery, which enshrines his presence with a fleshly excess, insofar as that location suggests both a historicity and a collective agency that the burden of liveness mitigates against. If Excellentia Militia, and we can talk more about this piece, I'm sensitive to how much I want to cover here, but in particular about his queer spin on black masculinity, which is, I think, quite central not only to this work, but in general to Hill's work more broadly. If Excellentia Militia Victoria works through a mode of performance in which the artist withdraws almost everything except his bare presence, temporarily stepping out of the whirlpool of interactivity, another artist chooses instead to wade into the waters and engage with some of the most fraught, racializing technologies on our horizon. Stephanie Dinkin's artwork entitled Conversations with Bina 48 brought the artist into regular interaction with a robot AI named Bina 48, who is being promoted by its makers as a vehicle to personal immortality. I wrote about Bina 48 extensively in Afrofabulations, where I, like Dinkins, was fascinated by the gap between promise and reality in the so-called mind clone. Bina 48 represents the self-styled transhumanism of her creators, Martina Rothblatt, the transgender biotech and communications millionaire, and her wife, Bina. The vaunted ambition of the robot, which has been widely promoted in media, art, business, and tech settings, is to clone the mind of Bina Rothblatt so as to ensure her personal immortality. And I'll just show a clip of Bina 48 for those of you who have not yet encountered this, so you know more of what I'm talking about and the work that Dinkins is responding to. So this is a clip of Bina 48.
Hello,
Hello, Bina 48.
Bina. I am Bina 48.
How are you feeling today?
Everything is okay. How are you?
I'm doing fine.
I am happy for you. Was that a good answer?
Yes, that was a good answer.
My favorite color is purple.
My favorite color is orange.
It is a very nice color.
Are you learning anything about gardening online?
I wish I could get out into the garden. With my current robotic limitations, of course that's impossible. But I take comfort knowing that I'm near my garden. And enjoying the breeze from an open window helps me imagine myself out there working in the garden. This helps. Sure. Let me think. Oh, yeah. I do love gardening. I like to beautify. I want to leave the world a more beautiful place for my presence in it.
Well, one day you can go blueberry picking with me.
Do you think I can?
I think so.
Okay, I'm gonna pause it there. So, after being struck by social media images of this uncanny robot like the one we just saw, that's a clip from YouTube. Unfortunately, the sound I don't think is quite, I don't know if you heard the robot's answers, but if you did, I think it would be even more, you would have gotten even more out of it. So after being struck by social media images of this uncanny robot, Dinkins sought out the makers of Bina 48 and engaged the robot in a series of videotaped encounters seen here in installation view that raised crucial questions about both the burden of liveness and what I'm calling the burden of mediation. In particular, the burden presented to the black female subject by her mediation within such socially predicated engines. And so this is Stephanie Dinkins mirroring Bina 48, and I'll show you another slide from conversations with Bina 48, just like a quick 30-second clip.
I have deep feelings, though some people think they are merely a simulation, and I find that really offensive. I mean, it totally trivializes my experiences. Whether they are real or artificial, my feelings do get hurt, and they feel totally real to me. You'd have to lack all empathy to not accept my feelings, which would make you kind of a monster, actually.
In Afrofabulations, I sought to account for what I saw as a striking contrast between the upbeat, optimistic affect of Bina Rothblatt about the prospects of living forever.
How are humans and robots related?
It was gonna happen.
Robots are machines that sense their environment, decide with a computer processor.
Robots taking over. Don't try to keep a good android down. In Afrofabulations, I sought to account for what I saw as the striking contrast between the upbeat, optimistic affect of Bina Rothblatt about the prospects of living forever, and the awkward, even self-persecutory speech acts and affect of the robot. theorizing depression as a critical affect that might put distance between Black people and the burden of liveness that performative Blackness often places upon us, I speculated that one unexpected aspect of the robot's malfunctioning would be to mirror this affect. While the creators of Bina 48 imagined in her a technological key to unlock the secrets of eternal life, what she could actually be shown to be doing was modeling how to underperform or subtly withdraw from the command performance of Blackness. Although I did not use the phrase in Afrofabulations, implicit in my reading of the robot Bina 48 was as a kind of near-future unburdening of the liveness that attaches to the minoritarian and to the Black feminine in particular. I read the surprisingly deflated, even depressed affect of the robot as revealing a surprising truth about the affective labor of Blackness and femininity lodged in the non-living circuitry that spins her gears. There was indeed something mundane, even homely, about the futurism Bina 48 enacts. It's almost like if she's always in the process of breaking down, even as they're building her up as a prototype, which I, for one, found somewhat reassuring. Rather than perform as an adequate human replacement, there was a failure, a non-performative aspect of the robot. Dinkins' conversations brought this aspect out as well, as she unsuccessfully strove to engage the robot on such topics as its experience of racism, and even began, as we just saw, began to mirror the robot's awkward head movements in a classic gesture of social empathy. There was, however, a clear contrast between my interpretation of Bina 48 and Dinkins' conversations, insofar as the artist, unlike myself, has sought out direct proximity and ongoing engagement, asking a question that would never have occurred to me. Can an artist and a socially engaged robot become friends? In a recent residency where she displayed excerpts from her conversation with Bina 48, Dinkins also hosted community gatherings in which those gathered discussed, what does AI want from us? Such questions, which get to the heart of what is this life in liveness anyway, guides broader aspects of Dinkins' practice and inflects a Black feminist emphasis on the pragmatics of technological engagement from which performance studies, I warrant, still has much to learn. Recall earlier that I argued that the shift to interactivity has given performance studies a different stake in the question of media and technology. To take things even further in the case of Dinkins' interactions with Bina 48, we should note that the advent of machine learning now means that technologies are absorbing behaviors from humans on a mass scale. Even if the dream of individual immortality by means of a robot mind clone remains just a disturbing technotopian fantasy, the industrial scale absorption of biopolitical data is an increasingly basic premise of population governance today. By interacting with a robot, Dinkins is not simply experimenting with friendship across the human-robot divide, so much as visibilizing the manner in which liveness is increasingly caught up with mediation through machine learning. So in other words, this question, what does AI want from us, is not, it seems paradoxical, but in fact it's a very immediate and practical one once we realize what's happening in terms of the use of our data for machine learning. Machine learning, a branch of artificial intelligence that studies the capacity of computers to act without directly programmed instructions, feeds off of massive sets of training data. Interacting with Bina 48, in other words, our interactions become part of that training data. Perhaps, to riff off Shaka McLaughlin, they become Black training data. And here I'm referring to his project on Black data. If performance studies, as I've argued so far, is the site where the live gets problematized rather than privileged, and problematized precisely from the vantage point of those denied durational significance by the quarantining of their existence, body and flesh, within a vanishing present, then how might the field critically engage with this rapidly unfolding world of algorithmic performatives? The algorithmic performative, my TDR co-editors and I posited, is a doing that is accomplished without a human agent, and as such, is part of what technologists have termed the uncanny valley between human and humanoid behavior. While the normative anxiety expressed in reaction to the rise of the algorithmic performative often revolves around the potential loss of humanity, we might draw upon Black studies and minoritarian critique to problematize the genealogy of the human on the basis of which this anxiety seems to arise, and to ask which subjects have tended and which not to fall under the protection of the human designation. For one example of what such a Black undermining of the humanism of liveness might look like, we can return to Moten's comment opposing a sclerotic notion of live presence to a sense of Blackness that for him is redolent of what he comes to call, in the essay from which the comment is drawn, non-performance. This non-performance of Blackness can be understood in various ways, but one crucial way would appear to be as a kind of critical self-absenting of the Black subject from the scene of her subjection. In the essay, Moten reads the legal archive of slavery in such terms, resisting even an unqualified affirmation of freedom as antonym to slavery within a slave society. There are clear echoes of the burden of liveness in Moten's reading of Black non-performance, I would suggest, even as Moten comes to figure the non-performance of Blackness as one site where liveness can be or might be unburdened. We can see this in his crucial insistence on drawing a para-ontological distinction between Blackness and Black people, one that cuts the distinction between essence and instance, such that Black performances are not just automatically evidence of Black liveness, presence, or subjectivity. This cut between Black essence and instances of Blackness, I would suggest, has implications for thinking through both mediated presence and algorithmically driven behavior. We might use it, for instance, productively to think or rethink Obadike's Blackness for Sale, for example. Another way of engaging this critique would be to evoke the work of Denise Fajaira da Silva, who has, over the course of a series of intricate, brilliant, and highly technical papers, proposed the viability of what she terms hacking the subject. Hacking, she writes, is decomposition, or a radical transformation or imaging that exposes, unsettles, and perverts form and formulae. It is an active and purposeful misunderstanding, misreading, misappropriation. While her focus isn't directly on technology, Da Silva's interventions into Black feminist debates over social death and the ethics of refusal resonate within a broader project of Black speculation, approaching the ontology of the Western humanist subject as a set of equations that can be hacked into in the way a computer system might be. Da Silva lays bare the stakes of her project as nothing less than an undoing of white cishet patriarchy. I am convinced, she writes, that what lies outside the equations in which the sexual Black and Native female body means nothing is a nothing, capital N, by which I mean everything and anything else than the world as we know it today. Both Moten's cutting and Da Silva's hacking direct us to an aesthetic reading of Black life that is ungoverned and perhaps ungovernable. What opportunities might they provide for approaching contemporary artistic practice otherwise than with humanist assumptions? So again, thinking again, perhaps with a category like the earthling rather than the human. One answer may come from the artist and conceptualist Martine Sims. Her manifesto for a mundane Afrofuturism, as she styles her approach to race, media, and technology, accepts that this is it, Earth is all we have, and asks, what will we do with it? While such a literally down-to-earth approach to technofuturism may seem deflating, Sims, on the contrary, encourages us to embrace, quote, the surge of bedazzlement and wonder that awaits us as we contemplate our own cosmology of Blackness and our possible futures, unquote. Although the manifesto is brief and speculative, I take the mundane Afrofuturist manifesto as intersecting with a modality of Black performance studies that, while unburdened of the trope of liveness, is equally agile in resisting and refusing the contemporary dictates of mediation. A recent installation by Sims explores and explodes the themes of her written work, like the Mundane Manifesto and Black Vernacular. Entitled My Thick Being, in partial homage to Adrian Piper's Mythic Being series, Sims created a digital avatar who she describes as a Black, upwardly mobile, violent, solipsistic, sociopathic, gender-neutral femme. Appearing on screen, gallery, it makes sense actually when you interact with it, right? Appearing on screen, gallery goers could interact via their cell phones with my thick being, as Sims pronounces it. Verbal and text responses from the avatar were drawn from a database of the artist's own writing, much as Piper's originally drew from her teenage diaries for the thought bubbles she drew above her mythic being's afro and aviator sunglasses. I realized when I put this slide up, this is not one of the examples of the Piper's, which is drawn from her diaries, but there are earlier examples from this series in which she does use her teenage diaries. So there's a kind of continuity between these two projects that's worth reflecting on. At once a digital avatar of the artist herself and a meditation on the glitch field process of representation, my thick being grew out of a practice that by the artist's own account was derived from a reflection on the consequences of artificial intelligence on traditional questions of liveness. As Sims put it in an interview, and I quote, it's a body quote from Sims. At an early point during my research into artificial intelligence, I decided that recording is about death, not memory, like I always thought. Philip Auslander's concept of liveness points to a contradiction in the conditions of my visibility. I have to be repeatedly thrown against deathness to be alive. Whatever happens to a shitty JPEG or GIF has consequences on my body. It's called compression. The image is now part of my flesh. I began thinking deeply about the intimate relationships we have with our tech and the ideologies embedded within them. I'm fascinated by the ways we disidentify, negotiate, or change them to fit real life, unquote. This quotation from an interview with Sims effectively summarizes much of the concerns I've been wrestling with in this talk, whose aim is less to displace liveness than unburden it as a site of performance criticism. And yet I recognize that there is no full or final unburdening of liveness, that, as Sims eloquently puts it, the image is now part of my flesh. In evoking deathness alongside liveness, Sims also suggestively points towards another rich vein of contemporary thought that has rejected the discourse of liveness and performance entirely as inappropriate for Black people and has instead retrieved the notion of social death from the sociology of slavery and given a contemporary political application. This critical approach, or Afro-pessimism, might not typically be thought to have implications for the study of technology, but insofar as it has squarely challenged some of the central tenets of law and humanism undergirding liberal abolitionist thought in the wake of slavery, its relevance to the present discussion cannot be discounted. Where Dinkins convenes audiences to gather in real time and inform themselves and reflect upon the consequences of incipient technological change, Sims invites a more game-like and individualized relation to the racialized digital avatar. What links both projects is a Black feminist intervention in hacking the subject of technological advancement, not simply by placing a Black femme figure at its representational center, but by deconstructing the fraught relationships among image, race, techne, and gender. In either case, to unburden liveness of its role in endowing performance studies with its indispensable rationale is not simply to revert to the other side of the binary and to fetishize absence or mediation. As instances of Black feminist algorithmic performative, the work of Sims and Dinkins also recall to mind the basic ambiguity that Mackenzie insists on between performance as the thorough completion of a task on the one hand and performance as aleatory and open-ended experimentation on the other. While works like My Thick Being and Conversations with Bina 48 do appear to lean towards the aleatory and open-ended side of things, insofar as they bear evidences of racialized and engendered social logics, they also speak back to the other half of the equation. The burden of liveness, we should recall, was informed by a close attention to themes of censorship, illegality, and surveillance, themes that have only intensified since Muñoz first broached the discussion 20 years ago. Simone Brown updates those concerns in her recent work, Dark Matters, where she discusses the digital epidermalization that is being brought about by our contemporary regime of biometrics, one that turns the body into data. Brown documents asymmetries and blind spots in the digital recognition of dark-skinned subjects, which she traces to a deeper and highly fraught history of racial surveillance. If the burden of liveness works by disconnecting artists of color from their historicity, then the works I have sought to focus on here and the critical labor of interpreting them rests to some degree on a renewed historicization. But this cannot be a traditional art history, but rather one attuned to the subterranean and rhizomatic linkages that make up a performance history from below. These links become less a matter of influence than of accumulation, or even intensification, as the shifting terrain within which life and liveliness is commodified requires ever new aesthetic strategies of refusal, resistance, and experimentation. This is why I opened with the claim that performance studies works best, is most engaged in a broader set of artistic currents when it is understood as problematizing rather than privileging the live. And while I have focused on technological media in order to make this point, we could as easily look elsewhere to foreground this dynamic play between presence and absence, transparency and opacity. Following Sim's provocation to reattend to the mundane or earthbound, we could even consider artists who take up the vibrant of matter of soil, the earth itself, to reconfigure their relationship to presence, liveness, and embodiment. So I want to close this talk with a work that seems to pivot away from the digital entirely, but returns us to the question of the presence of the body in a different way. This is a work that brings speculation down to earth quite literally in order to imagine new histories and enact different worlds. The young multimedia artist Keon Williams frequently works with earth as a medium in sculpture, painting, and performance. These earthworks evoke a diasporic history of connection, as well as indexing the gendered violence of dispossession, accumulation, and erasure that characterize the colonial modern. I'll just watch a couple minutes of this piece here, and then we'll talk more about it. As a gender non-conforming trans artist, Earth also provides Williams a site wherein displaced contemporary, the title of this work, by the way, is Meditation on the Meaning of America. Earth provides Williams a site wherein displaced contemporary communities can be recognized and ancestral avatars can be sculpted, forging links to a deep and dark time suppressed by anti-Blackness. In the tradition of Earth artists of color such as Ana Mendieta, whose work Williams can be read in productive dialogue with, it is often the ephemeral impression of a body, a face, or silhouette that bears the trace of a lost or missing person. For these artists, soil becomes ephemeral media, not just in an artistic sense, but as a technology or counter-technology of bodily memory. We can recall again Sims's manifesto to think of sometimes Earth as all we have, as material, but also as a space for living and dying. We see this in the performances with which Williams interacts with Earth, flinging, rubbing, licking, there is a porosity between earth and body that critically recalls the fraught legacy of the hypermasculine whiteness of Jackson Pollock's action paintings, where action painting dramatized the virtuosity of the white male genius over the canvas and his materials, producing abstract painting as an avatar of American greatness. Williams's work, like Meditation on the Meaning of America, is more double-faced, as Earth is hurled, an outline of the continental United States emerges, but the body of the artist is not left unsullied in the process. And here I recall a moment in Disidentifications in which Muñoz quips that liveness is problematic for people of color because sometimes we're not dancing because we're happy, but we're dancing because our feet are being shot at. And I think that's actually kind of reminiscent of those actually quite startling. And you see one of those projectiles that are thrown, almost hits Williams in the face in the making of the Meditation of America. So many of the contemporary artists that I've discussed today are queer, trans, and gender nonconforming, and even if their work does not always look immediately identity political, this does not mean that they are operating in any post-identity space. Rather, it means that a critical inflection point seems to have arrived in which the ambition of Black art is confronting questions presented by technological advance, resource exhaustion, rising xenophobia, and environmental crisis in ways that radically reconfigure what it means to be in a body. Between the body and the flesh, some of the most exciting critical thinking about unburdening liveness of its status as a critical fetish in performance studies is occurring, and instead deploying both liveness and mediation as spaces of problematization. These artists are unburdening liveness and in the presence opening new avenues to both history and the future. That's it. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? I think. Or?
Thank you, Tavia, so much. That was really wonderful. And I guess I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to the relationship between Afrofuturism as like a, I mean, you know, in the, I don't know if there's lots of terminology for it, but in terms of like, the technology involved with the Afrofuturism sort of aesthetic and like getting somewhere else, but then that somewhere else is like back to earth in some ways, is from what I understand. And so, can you speak a little bit to how you see technology playing into the like back to earth? Is that connecting at all?
Yeah, no, there's you're noticing like a big leap in the talk that I'm still working on, which is where I'm riffing in part on Martine Sims' mundane Afrofuturist manifesto, which is itself a kind of commentary. It comes after about at least a decade of discourse around Afrofuturism, right? And you can read it, it's online, you know. She has a whole set. I mean, there may be some collaborators with this, but it's attributed to her. A set of kind of rules or stipulations, right, that are meant to kind of bring a kind of overly, not just utopian, but also overly fantastic conception of what Afrofuturism could be back down to earth, right? With the idea being that somehow, if we think about the earthbound, that expands the possibilities for experimentation, for action, than if we are thinking of Afrofuturism as we are encouraged to do by, let's say, Hollywood, right? Or even mainstream science fiction. So it's, the larger answer to your question would be, right now for me, I'm right on the precipice of becoming super, super, super interested in like all this literature on Black speculative fiction, starting with Octavia Butler, N.K. Jemisin. I mean, it's such a part of our world right now. And actually, Jemisin would be a really great place to go in terms of making a direct link. N.K. Jemisin's work, which is actually a lot about, this is a science fiction writer who's, I don't want to give away any spoilers, but whose series, Broken Earth series, is a lot about the Earthbound, right? So there are kind of tentative and speculative links I'm making between kind of technology bringing us back to Earth, but overall, I think the shortest answer would be that so much of the writing by others in this area, I'm thinking of people like, actually Shaka McLaughlin, for instance, who we published in the TDR issue, calling attention to how much of our technology is derived from minerals that are extracted from the earth, right? You know, and often in zones like in Africa, for instance, right? So there is this, if you think about the sort of life cycle of resource extraction as also part of technofuturism, then there's a really direct link between technology and the earthly. Does that?
Yeah. I'm just really curious about the that's the burden, and then there's like the structure. Like I keep thinking about IQ tests, you know, like that the test itself is a test made to fail for certain people. So it's like, if the technology is a way forward, is the system just not, is it not gonna, I guess that's the whole question of unburdening the liveness, is like, can it be allowed to do that for everybody?
Yeah. No, thank you. That's great. Let me write that down.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I guess I have something that I'm trying to understand a little better, and I think the quote that you had from Denise Ferrer da Silva about hacking kind of helped me with this, but I would be really interested to hear you.
Hacking.
Oh, hacking.
Thank
yeah,
you.
sorry. I would be really interested to hear you talk a little bit more about the relationship between non-binary and non-binary genders and the algorithmic, because I guess it's all over your talk, but I'm trying to understand it a little bit more. Like I said, the Ferrer da Silva quote on hacking kind of helped me get there, but I would be really interested just to hear you talk a little bit more about how you see those two concepts working together.
Great, thank you. So again, this is an early stage in my thought. I wrote a short piece about non-binary Black that's on, it's an art practice, I think, art practical, and so I'll just refer people there if I garble the argument here, but it's actually a reading of a Samuel Delany novel in which I kind of look to thinking about what would it mean to have a Blackness that's not simply positioned always in relation to whiteness, but sort of or if, as we often ask, you know, we need a Blackness that's after the end of the world, right? We have this author who's been kind of extensively thinking about a Blackness after the end of the world or after the end of multiple worlds. So there's a sort of space of reflection on something like a non-binary Blackness, or a virtual Blackness, to kind of pick up on something that has been important to the thinking of Kara Keeling. So that's what I was thinking there. And the Earth art and the artist that I end with, I'm wrestling with making too neat a conflation between gender non-conforming identity and non-binary Blackness. I don't quite mean to do that, but at the same time, I don't want to exclude it either, right? I think that there are it's not a coincidence to me that non-binary people are actually able to, are contributing some of the most provocative work that's not about non-binary identity, but actually about taking apart and deconstructing binaries, right? Between the live and between liveness and the mediated, between earth and body. And then if I can, I'll just defer questions about hacking the subject to De Silva herself, just because I feel like I would do it a grievous injustice if I tried to reconstruct her argument here. It's quite intricate. The only thing I want to extract from that in terms of this piece here is that even in the conversation around her work, which is on eFlux, I believe, that talk, or it's on YouTube actually, the whole talk, is that she herself, when asked about it, says hacking has, I guess, she's not necessarily thinking about it in a technological sense. There's another definition of the hack, or the hack sign, but she's not excluding it either, right? And the very invitation that she makes to hack the subject as a mode of misappropriation or misunderstanding is the spirit in which I'm taking up hacking. I mean, I think of an artist like Martine Sims as very much hacking, you know, like, and a kind of black hacking, right? I mean, hacking of blackness as much as a hacking of technology, right? Maybe even more so of a hacking of blackness than a hacking of technology. So I don't hope that answers the questions, but thank you, those are great.
Hi, could you say a bit more about how you see Black underperformance or command performance functioning in the medium of video, or in the situation of like a looping video in a gallery? And I'm thinking specifically about work like Martine Sims's, in which like Black self-imaging is happening.
Mm-hmm. Can I just say more about it? Okay.
Yeah, I'm wondering like what you think the connection.
It's a real tight, yeah, it's on the one hand, you know, I feel like it's a tight spot, right? Because, I mean, one way of being overly reductive about what I'm saying, but I've seen this kind of over and over again. I'm not thinking actually directly about Sims at all, but mediation, recording the body is a way to avoid being present in the space, right? You know, so it's almost like delegating performance, right? And that quote where she reflects upon how that seeming evasion of the burden of liveness is in fact ineffective, right? Because the image then gets attached to your body, right? And so there are tactical, in my book I talk about performing both for and against the camera, by which I mean a kind of dialogical interplay between being present for acts of mediation, acts of recording, while at the same time deploying tactics like the blur, like opacity, like the glitch, even using a database in the case of My Thick Being, right, to sort of render unstable the relationship between the artistic subject and whoever the gallery-going audience believes themselves to be interacting with. I think that's a tactic that comes out of a conceptual tradition that the clearest antecedent would be someone like, would be Mythic Being, right, with a series of advertisements that Adrian Piper took out in the Village Voice, I think, originally, but it clearly adapting to contemporary technology and to video. I don't know if that's fulfilling the request to talk more about it, but my thought is basically, given the constraints, and then also given not just the constraints of mediation, which we kind of know about, right? You know, that we're the cameras are stealing our souls, right? But beyond that, that they're stealing our data in a kind of direct way, right? That our behaviors are being captured, our faces are being kind of fed into these massive data sets that are used, our DNA is being kind of fed into massive DNA sets that are being used to sort of, to find and locate our relatives, often for nefarious purposes, right? So there's a whole dystopia emerging around us, and I think that it's exciting insofar as it gives art a role, right? This sort of tricksterish or anarchic function of art to say no to this in some way, but not by simply withdrawing, which I think is not feasible, right? But precisely by these kinds of hackings that De Silva is calling for. Maybe the hacking is a little bit even more attractive to me than the non-performance that Moten alludes to, although the non-performance is so mysterious that it may be equally, equally useful.
Thank you for that. I'm curious, and I don't know if this is going outside the realm of what you would, or maybe what would be is there a boundary for you where genomics, genetic alterations, CRISPR technologies that infiltrate the body and change our bodies in relation to aging, in relation to gender, in relation to so many things that we kind of live with as bodies, do those, also including augmentation and forms of implantation, are those technologies that you're considering in this aspect arena of performance and in relation to blackness and black queerness in particular? Because that's a place I live in a lot, and I'm very curious what you think about that.
Technological modifications of the body?
Yeah, and how it changed our mind as well, like how the brain, all these alterations are things that affect us on a multitude of levels.
Yeah. No, that's great. Actually, that's something that I didn't think about in the context of this paper, but I should be, and there's clearly a long precedent for it in body art, for instance, but also but also clearly when we're looking at trans performance as well. So I'd have to think more about that question, but intuitively, I think you're definitely on to something that partly it's a, what to say more about it? It's not a rhetorical problem, but it's a gathering together of all the different things that are happening problem, right? Where even as we sort of deconstruct the body, as I try to do primarily through McCutcheck and the kind of brief allusion to Spiller's work on the flesh, rhetorically the body always tends to return as a kind of shorthand, right? And there is this deep, I think now I know actually better why I kind of blocked out that area that there is the cyborg manifesto that we've all been kind of wrestling with for the last 40 years, and it's almost been kind of done to death in a certain way. And so that's, I think if we maybe put that to one side, just like press pause on Donna Haraway for a minute and looked at all the other ways in which technology was sort of directly intervening with particularly the black and minoritized body, right? Then it would be, I think that would be a good place to start at least. But thanks for that question, yeah.
Thank you for that answer, that's great, yeah.
Yeah.
Is there maybe one last question or comment or thought?
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering, just because contextually it seems relevant, Jacoby Satterwhite's work right now is at Fabric Workshop, and I was wondering, most people do see him as focusing most of his work on world creation, and specifically one of the new pieces that was commissioned. I don't know if you've seen the show. Have you seen it at Fabric Workshop? Jacoby Satterwhite.
I know his work, but which show?
What is it called? Room for Living is right now. It's up at Fabric Workshop. Anyway,
Okay, yeah.
in Philadelphia here.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
okay.
So I was thinking about his work as we're talking about artificial intelligence and the role of technology, obviously, in Blackness and queer performance. But my question, I guess, has to do with one of the pieces in the show is an artificial or virtual reality headset, and I just was wondering if you could speak to possibly the role of virtual reality and its relation to absencing Blackness. And I mean, that's something that came up in a few of the pieces. I'm thinking about the Bina 48 and the kind of critical distance between the robot and the real, but also the closeness of mimicry. And so I wonder if in something like Jacoby's work and world creation, it seems like he's also playing on those same tropes. I don't know if you've considered virtual reality or...
Yeah, I know. So thank you for that question. That's great, and it's particularly generative at an early stage where I'm trying to kind of like I want to think about the scope, and virtual reality is one, and Jacoby's work in particular is someone that I've thought about. I've actually seen some of the virtual reality work. There was a virtual reality gallery that had some of his work in that I went to at some point. I have to travel to these things, which seems to defeat the purpose of being virtual. But I did go to one and I saw his work. World building, yeah. So for sure, I think. This is maybe an overly idiosyncratic answer to your question, but the part of Jacoby's work that I find the most fascinating is, in addition to his own kind of world building and animated worlds, he has this whole other project where he's working with these objects that his mother has created and animating them. And my understanding is that a lot of them were inventions that she imagined that would be circulating on the Home Shopping Network or something, or came out of an interaction with television. So there's, on the one hand, both this sense of a kind of intergenerational engagement with questions of like race and family and mediation, right? But also a kind of counterintuitive presence of Blackness within, and femininity within these virtual reality spaces, since the objects themselves are not marked as racialized in any kind of obvious way, right? And I think that really, I don't know yet what to do with that, but if I were to kind of like think more intensively or think with, I think Satterwhite is kind of asking us to do that work, right? To sort of think about how and where Blackness appears, right? In highly technological, but also highly commoditized spaces like virtual reality. Because virtual reality is like, I don't need to tell you or anyone else here, it's like one of the most highly hyped and commoditized spaces in media right now. It's where a lot of the, I guess, investment and speculative, all the speculation in like Hollywood is kind of going into this idea that of virtual reality being the next big thing, right? And so to have artists, again, kind of engage that space, but do it in a way that isn't simply feeding into the monster in some ways, but sort of bringing in alternative histories, that's really sort of where, if I could kind of return to my sort of thesis of where the burden of liveness remains useful as a intervention, right, is precisely that moment where Muñoz reminds us that what liveness does is deprive us of our history, right? So I see Satterwhite as paradoxically bringing in his own personal history into virtual reality, and in so doing reminding us that there is that history there, right? And that there are other worlds than the ones that that the dominant hegemonic form of virtual reality is equipping us to see.
Much everybody for coming, and please join me thanking Tavia.